There are two forms of equilibrium. One is known as dynamic equilibrium. The other is known as static equilibrium. Let's first describe the difference. Dynamic equilibrium is maintenance of the body position, mainly your head, in response to rotational acceleration and deceleration. That's a fancy way of saying rotating your head side to side. When that occurs, we must be able to balance, which is done using the semicircular ducts. These structures are involved in your dynamic equilibrium. The utricle and saccule are involved in static equilibrium. Static equilibrium is maintenance of the body position, mainly your head, relative to the force of gravity. So the key differences between dynamic and static equilibrium is one involves rotation of the head, the other one involves gravity. We're going to be looking at some videos that will help clarify this. But the first thing we need to do is know that the semicircular ducts are involved in dynamic equilibrium, whereas the utricle and saccule are involved in static equilibrium. Here's a nice, beautiful drawing of the ear. A little more detail, but this one would be a great image to study. We've got the external ear, auricle, meatus, tympanic membrane, the three auditory ossicles, malleus, incus, stapes. We see the stapes sitting in a little hole known as the oval window. In the inner ear, we have the cochlea, which kind of looks like a snail, and the vestibular apparatus, which has the semicircular canals, as well as two sacs within this region, known as the utricle and saccule. Notice the nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve has one branch coming from the vestibular apparatus and one branch coming from the cochlea. One for equilibrium and one for hearing. Note the eustachian tube extends from the middle ear to the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is the upper part of your throat. Let's look at the process of hearing. This drawing represents major steps that occur in order to detect and interpret sound waves. I'd like to refer you to an animation you can find in Canvas. This animation will guide you through this figure. But you'll see the sound waves entering, vibrating the tympanic membrane, which vibrates the malleus, then the incus, then the stapes. As this stapes vibrates, it's going to produce waves of fluid known as perilymph that migrate through the cochlea. As these waves get forced into the cochlea, it disrupts a membrane in the central part of the cochlea. Within this central part of the cochlea are sensory neurons found in the spiral organ, or organ of Corti. That stimulates neurons that are then transmitted to the brain for interpretation. But again, I will refer you to the animation to help clarify this process. Let's look at static equilibrium. Static equilibrium is body position relative to gravity and linear acceleration. Linear acceleration is nodding your head up and down. Ultimately, nodding your head up and down changes the force of gravity on the body. As the force of gravity changes, it disrupts a membrane made up of little tiny crystallized calcium carbonate, known as otoliths. The otolithic membrane is made up of these little tiny calcium carbonate crystals known as ear stones or ear crystals. As gravity changes, that force of gravity changes the position of the otolithic membrane. As the otolithic membrane changes, it stimulates the neurons, and that information is transmitted to the brain in order to help you balance. So we have static equilibrium, which monitors changes in gravity. The structures are housed in the vestibule, which are known as the utricle and saccule, and this involves shifting of the otolithic membrane. Dynamic equilibrium is a more dramatic movement of the head. We call this rotational acceleration and deceleration, moving your head side to side. The structures that help balance in response to these movements are the semicircular canals or ducts. Inside these semicircular canals, there are neurons located in a structure known as the cupula. And as your head shifts, fluid moves this cupula, and that stimulates the neurons. These neurons then transmit to your brain, and you respond by balancing. So the cupula is much like the otolithic membrane in that it will move in response to changing position and stimulate hair cells that are found in a region called the crista ampullaris. It's a little region within each of the semicircular ducts. Very difficult to understand these processes looking at pictures. So I will again reference an animation. It's hearing and equilibrium animation found on Canvas. That one should help us visualize our ability to balance and maintain equilibrium.